places that have more domain names also have more autonomous systems. Makes sense. And again, here we're scaled by population, we're colored by subcontinent. And if I color this one by local hosting, wow, I get an even better partition, at least to the naked eye. Now, there are some major exceptions here. For example, India has very little local hosting for various reasons, and it's up on the right side. It's a large internet economy that still doesn't do very much local hosting. I can then pull filters over this. We can take a look at specific regions. So here's Africa, for example. A lot of red dots. Local hosting in Africa is difficult so far, although that is changing. In the largest upper right, you can see the South African internet economy is the largest. It also has a reasonably high percentage, about 42% by this estimate, of local hosting. Some of the smaller places do as well. You know, it's not a hard and fast rule. Eritrea has 86% by our measurement, even though they're quite small down there in the lower left. South Asia, some large economies up and to the right still don't do a lot of local hosting. A lot of this is in the United States. And then this is what we're here for. Here's the look at the Middle East. So you can see that we have virtually the entire spread from very small countries on the internet, not in terms of population, like Yemen or Syria to the left, and Turkey and Iran to the right. So interestingly, in the Middle East, the people who have the most local hosting are either very big or very small. So Turkey and Syria, both in excess of 60% by this measure of local hosting. Iran 43%, Israel 42%, Kuwait 34%, and we work our way down until we get to the other end of the spectrum, where we have maybe 10% of the domains being locally hosted in the UAE, and maybe only about 7% in Iraq. Which leads you to the question, well, if it's not in these countries, where else is it? Well, so we can answer that by looking at the answers that were returned. The US, I think, is, as you might expect, one of the largest content partners. If it's not in the country, it's likely to go to the US. Smaller percentages of reliance on the US, of course, in countries like Turkey that do a lot of its own hosting, and higher percentages as you work your way down the list. Germany is quite important, especially to Iran, which obviously has less reliance on the United States. Hosting in London is, of course, important. And then, for various people, Canada, the Netherlands, sometimes Singapore, also come into the mix. We can take a look, right? We've taken a look here at all of the things under the CCTLD, but we can also look at the second-level domains that are important. And it's interesting to me, and Fuad talked a little bit about it before in terms of the government hosting, that there's a consistent pattern. Typically, the .com equivalent, or .co, .cc, will be the one that has the weakest local hosting. Maybe they're motivated by going for the cheapest hosting or what have you. Those things tend to end up overseas. .org tends to be a little closer to home. The educational domain, or the AC, tends to be a little more close to home, higher local hosting. And the government sites, of course, tend to be rather strongly hosted in the local country. And it's interesting because this specific pattern replicates itself across the region in all 5 of these that I've highlighted here. So returning to this is the plot, the big picture. You might reasonably ask, what's the trend? Because we want to figure out not only, well, the picture today may be somewhat disappointing in terms of the percentage of content that's hosted locally, but we want to see what the trend could be. What could we predict for next year? So Iran and Turkey are both growing, and they're growing rather strongly. Of course, they're growing economically, but they're also growing in terms of their internet presence, the structure of the internet. And this is a plot from Dine Research. The blue here shows you the growth in domestic autonomous systems in Saudi Arabia. It's going up and to the right very slowly from over the last 5 years. The purple line is Turkey, also growing a little faster than Saudi Arabia. The red line is Iran, which this year will pass Turkey as the country with the largest number of domestic autonomous systems, which I've been kind of looking at this curve and predicting this for several MENOGs now. Now it's finally the case. So a huge amount of growth here in these dimensions that we have identified as being important for the growth of local hosting. And if we take a look at a couple other statistics, you'll see that it's not simply internal growth that matters, that there are other factors that are probably coming into play. So, for example, here we've rescattered the same countries, and we're scattering them on the x-axis in terms of GDP per capita, and on the y-axis in terms of the number of cross-border autonomous systems. So here we're not simply counting autonomous systems who participate in the country, we're counting the ones that have international connectivity. So in previous work we've identified cross-border domestic autonomous systems as an important metric potentially for understanding internet disconnection. The countries that have fewer than about 20 of these international autonomous system relationships seem to be more fragile. They seem to be more susceptible to single point of control disconnection of the internet. So we scattered them here, and you can actually see that it does make a reasonable classification. We could draw a box somewhat arbitrarily and say, if you have more than $8,000 in GDP per capita, and you have at least the 20 border ASs, which seem to give a protective effect against internet disconnection, then the people in that box, at least to the naked eye, account for almost all of the countries on Earth that have more than 40% local hosting. So there's finance there, there's the growth of the local internet economy, but there's also some signal about international connectivity and diversity. So this is a situation where a country like Iran, which is growing very strongly internally, but is not growing at all at the border, it doesn't create new relationships between its domestic autonomous systems and the international community, is not going to enter this box. I mean, they still have a very strong local hosting environment, but if we look at the last 2 years or so, I believe this is since 2014, we see that Turkey has added 9 internationally connected autonomous systems. Israel added 9. The UAE actually added 11, which is unheard of for the UAE. As a result, those are sort of the 3 countries that I would highlight as being in the box. If we take a look, what does that imply? Well, Turkey's growing. It's growing It's growing internally, and it's growing across the border. Iran is growing internally, but not yet across the border. Now, that could change. This is a period of significant change for Iran, and we don't know how their international connectivity will evolve over the next couple of years, whether it will follow a trajectory to make them competitive with Turkey, perhaps even as a content hosting site. And then it's nice to see that the UAE is actually growing cross-border. We could predict, based on this, that the content hosting industry in the UAE may show some signs of invigoration in 2016. It would be nice to see them increase from their current ranking, which is 10 or 11% local hosted content, up to something more like 20 or 30% perhaps would be a reasonable thing to hope for. So, all of this is fairly abstract. You have to ask yourself, why would you study this at all? Right? For operators in particular, for those of us in this community who are studying how to build the internet, how to improve it, what's the point, right? Why would you care about local hosting? Well, if you don't have local hosting, then your content is somewhere else. And your customers, first of all, have this experience, right? So latency matters in terms of the experience for web content. And this is sort of the classic plot that shows it. Here are latencies from Ankara, measured over, I believe, a period of a month. We've taken the median latencies to all the different major markets on Earth. If you were hosting content from this region broadly, in Frankfurt or London, you're paying a 50 millisecond round-trip penalty for that content. And your users may or may not feel that as an impact depending on the applications that you're hosting there. If you're hosting it with Amazon East in the United States, you're paying 150 milliseconds round-trip. If you're somewhere on the west coast of the US, it's more than 200 milliseconds penalty that you're paying. If you're trying to get to Singapore, it's 300 milliseconds plus. And so in terms of user experience and customer satisfaction, the people who pay us money to carry traffic have an experience that suffers when we host content far away. Of course, the other thing that happens is very directly, there is a connection between the fate of the local domain industry and the local hosting industry. And when that link is broken, there's money going offshore that doesn't come back. So why do we have people in each country paying people in the United States to host their content, which is value that could be captured domestically? It's just lost. It's an export. It's literally an international trade flow. We can take a look, perhaps, to make this concrete, take a look at the top 10 providers who hosted content from these reconstructed CCTLDs. In the UAE, we see, I think, only one domestic provider in the top 10, Etisalat. They are number one, but everybody else on the list who's hosting or who's parking domains are people like CyrusOne and GoDaddy, and they're in the United States. If we move up to Saudi Arabia, we see 2 out of the top 10 that are domestic, mirroring their higher percentage of local hosting. If we go to Egypt, it gets better. We have, I think, half, so maybe 5 out of the top 10, including Telecom Egypt and Mobanil, that end up hosting the content for Egypt. The other 5 are elsewhere, potentially in the United States. In Iran, I think we reach 7 out of 10. At the top of the list are the Germans and the French, but then it's Iranian. Right? The local hosting environment there is strong. And then finally in Turkey, Turkey is the only country on my list where the top 10 are in fact Turkish. There are enough primary hosting providers here to host the primary domains that people are looking up and cover the space, which is, this is sort of the scenario you'd like to see when the local domain industry and the local content hosting industry are working hand in hand to effectively retain consumers' attention and direct it to sites that are hosted by people in the country, to keep all of this money on shore. So I think I'll wrap up. The slides are available online. I apologize that many of those are kind of eye charts. But I hope that you've seen that local hosting is not a simple thing to predict, but there are a few factors here that clearly seem to matter. One is purely economic. The GDP per capita is very strongly determinative of whether content is going to stay local. But then so is the size of the internet economy. So a healthy internet economy that has a lot of domestic autonomous system creation is more likely to be able to hang on to the content that's created and hosted by those autonomous systems. Of course, there are variables that are not technical and that we don't talk about very much: the political environment, the regulation of content, things that make it friendly or unfriendly for content hosters, large and small, to decide to stay in a country as opposed to trying to serve that country from somewhere else. Sometimes having other strong hosting countries in your neighborhood can be a drag. Now, in the Middle East, there aren't any very strong local hosting companies that are really exporting content hosting to each other. But you see this on the plots. If you go back, you'll see that Canada and Mexico, for example, have very relatively weak local hosting because they're right next door to the US. So they try a little less. Singapore tends to attract content from all around Southeast Asia. Even in Europe, a lot of people end up hosting in Germany because it's easy. What we identified here was that there are countries in the Middle East that have strong local hosting, primarily among them Turkey and Iran. There really isn't a center of gravity that has emerged here as a hub. We've talked about internet hubs. We've talked about content hubs. What does it take to be a cross-border hub? Nobody has really emerged yet in that capacity here in the Middle East, and it's hard to predict who that might be. According to these metrics, I think all of the, well, not all, most of the GCC countries have a per capita GDP that safely exceeds the $8,000 rough threshold, but it really hasn't translated into local hosting. As I showed you, the UAE, based on growth in international autonomous system connection may be a good candidate for the first to break out of that pattern, but we have to see. They're coming from a long way down. It's clear that Turkey and Iran are positioned to be the leaders were they to take a position which allowed them to be an attractive host of international content, or at least of regionally international content. But it's a good reminder that as with so much in internet growth and internet exchange points and content hosting, many of the important factors here are not going to be purely economic, and they're not going to be purely technical. So thanks very much. I appreciate your attention. And again, this is my transition time. This is perhaps the last in my sequence of talks on local hosting, but this topic is rich. There are a lot of ways to approach it. If you had additional thoughts on how this can be more accurately measured, I would love to hear them.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Any questions? Thanks. Do you have questions? Yes. Please come to the microphone, or come to you in this case. Go ahead.
Hi, Martin.
Hello, good. Martin Levy from Cloudflare. First of all, thank you very much for this series of talks over the years. Seriously, I think before I even ask a question, I will pretend I speak for the audience and say it is much appreciated and very informative on every step whatsoever. So thank you. All right, so my question is this, and obviously it's biased because I come from a content delivery network company, yes. But where do content delivery networks that have a presence within these countries play into these statistics? And where were they on your statistics? Were they just all grouped together in the US, or how do you explain that? Or is this another talk that may be needed in the future? Hint, hint.
Hint, hint, yeah. No, I take your hint. I think the study of content, the study of the interaction between CDNs and top-level domain hosting would be a really good one to go into. What we did here is we took the domains that were the apex domains in each of the zones and literally took the most popular A record that came back for those, as we saw. The contribution of CDNs is immensely important. The fact that they may not be hosting the top-level domain may not be a primary determinant of customer experience. A lot of the time, you may get the top-level content. It may come from San Francisco. But then the actual items that matter, the images, the video, and so forth, may in fact be coming from an in-country cache. And that just needs more analysis. I think it's possible that a lot of the, perhaps some of the CDN content here is being swept up in the US and the London and the Frankfurt estimators. We may be, in fact, undercounting in-country cache. I certainly hope we are. So.
And then just as another part, because if I link your talk to the previous talk, there is also the issue of where is the DNS being resolved for these sites as they spread around the world? Are they being resolved locally through either in-country deployments? PCH, for example, has done a large amount of this. Or is this happening still at the remote level? And I think that this is another area where the user experience has by far the improvement can be measured and seen country by country.
Right, I agree. We've done different presentations in the sequence. We've done different things with. Some of them have been local to us. Some have been wherever Dyn has their recursive infrastructure implemented. That's where the questions are being asked of authoritatives. In other cases, we've actually gone out and used the distributed global infrastructure that we had, or in some cases even open resolvers in country, to get an accurate picture of where the local market believes that content is hosted. But yeah, that's a methodological sore point. Mic number 2. Oh, there we
Hello?
go.
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Jim. Very interesting, and your methodology was really interesting. Continuing from the last question, have you ever tried to validate this? Because it was really interesting data and really interesting methodology to use Resolver to rebuild the zone files. But have you tried to validate that using, for example, detailed data or some other source of data to make sure that you have proper coverage of domains?
That would be a great systematic experiment to do. I spot checked in a few cases where we did have access to the actual ccTLDs. What becomes clear is that you're really measuring two different things. There's a lot of undercount using the passive DNS because you're only looking at domains that people actually looked up. And so it's a validation question. You need to identify that gap, and that gap is going to change country by country. But it's also, in some sense, a meaningful difference because so much of the ccTLD data tends to be a little bit old. Because they grow organically over time, they basically never get smaller. So it would be, we could work in the future on doing a broader study and really aligning that to, if we can get more ccTLD actual zone files to really calibrate the two approaches together.
And if you need any help from RIPE NCC to host that data or correlate that data, we would be more than happy in our science division. One other point I had was because you mentioned regulation might skew this data, which is completely right. For example, we know for a fact in Iran, there are regulations to host at least some type of content locally, yes, which is fair and it shows up, but then that will skew your conclusions because when you say, for example, when you say Iran and Turkey are competing, I think that might not be right because when you have regulation, so that's another point which I think in this kind, especially making forecasts, that should be taken into consideration.
I think that's, yeah, no, it's a good point. And in all of these, one of the things that has made me a little uncomfortable about delivering this sequence of talks is I may have made an implicit assumption that, that local hosting is an unmitigated good thing. But it's true. No country wants to be an information autarky. It's not healthy to have 100% local hosting. If you want to do that, North Korea has 100% local hosting. And that's not a healthy information economy. So we don't know, we can't just say, let's go up and to the right with this. We do know that you should have, presumably, to be in the main spectrum of countries, a local hosting percentage that shows that consumers and companies in country have a choice. So 20, 30, 40% seems reasonable to be able to retain if you have a hosting industry and the people who are registering domains can pick. Do you want it to go to 80, 90, 100%? Maybe not. So yes, that's an important background for the interpretation.
More questions? Yeah, can you speak to the microphone, please?
Always tricky.
Yeah. Good morning. There is a new trend recently, like to use web application firewalls, WAF. So in that case, the DNS resolution will show the IP as outside. Did you take that into account?
I did not, and that's an excellent point. There are many, many ways to host content. It goes to Martin's point about content hosting as well and CDNs. Yeah, this is not a monolithic space. So this would be a great topic for another talk. Thank you.
We'll have last two questions, one here and one there. So go ahead.
Hi, Jane Coffin from the Internet Society. Thank you very much, Jim. This is an issue we are focused on from the Internet Society's side as well. I know you described some of the barriers to sort of local hosting and connectivity. Could you give some more examples of good practices for countries with respect to local hosting? We often know that people think that just putting in a data center is going to magically make everything change. Right. But can you give us some more examples that would be helpful so we can look at the best practices from a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit far afield from sort of just the direct observational stuff, but I guess I would say that it's important to recognize that the delivery of content is this whole arc, that simply putting it in the data center won't matter if the local folks have service, for example, from a service provider that doesn't connect at the IXP, let's say, that is connected to the content hosting center, right? So there has to be low latency paths from local eyeballs to the local content. Local content by itself in a vacuum would be inappropriate. Yeah, I mean, we see people now, perhaps it's just the fact that money is easy to come by and interest rates are so low and people are building investment everywhere. There's a lot of local hosting coming online in places you wouldn't expect. And so it's hopeful because I think a lot of content may come to roost especially in the emerging markets, but it's only one part of the picture in terms of getting that content with low latency, with high reliability to the local audience.
Thank you.
Sure.
Last question?
Sure.
You need to turn it on.
Hello. This is Derya Altayev from Türk Telekom. From the statistics, I wonder if there is any statistics or work on investigating, for example, for people, the end users, internet users are usually using VPNs in this region. Is there any statistics covering this issue?
I don't have any direct observation there, but that is an important complication for this study. It's even more complicated in East Asia. We find that identifying a user by their end IP address has become increasingly unreliable because of all of the VPNs that take place. And people get benefits from that, but it also adds latency. It really complicates the assessment of local hosting. If you're going to use a VPN and the other endpoint comes out in London, and you're going to content in London, maybe that's okay. But yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't know of another study I could refer you to. That would be a great thing to study, though.
Just a very, very final question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jim, for your presentation.
Sure.
I think when you are talking about the statistics, the traffic is important here. If you go back to the slide about Iran, top 10 slide, I saw that, for example, you show Asiatic in the 4th or 5th. But of course we are hosting near 800 domain address, but the most traffic is hosted there, near 90 gigabit per second. But for example, Parse Online or other ISPs has maybe 3,000 or 4,000 domain address, but the traffic is near 5 gigabit per second. So is there any way to measure such things and use those statistics? Thank you.
Great, that's a very important distinction. All we did was count domains. We didn't really count the most important domains or the ones that have the critical high bandwidth content. So I believe that what you've cited may be true. For external researchers who are trying to do a longitudinal study that really covers the whole planet, we can't look at traffic, even if we could look at traffic. I think there's a lot of room here for local providers to participate in this conversation with researchers and give back information about maybe traffic volumes or something that might inform this, would fill in the missing dimensions. We just don't have a lot of the information about which domains are critically important from a content hosting perspective, other than the fact that maybe they're popular.
Thank you.
So, good point. All right, thanks very much. I've taken enough of your time.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks. So our next speaker will be Abdurrahman Ghadir. We're actually going to speak about his experience, or SaudiNet experience in deploying DNSSEC. So over to you, Abdurrahman.
Hello everybody, and good morning. I'm Abdurrahman Ghadir from SaudiNIC, which is the registry that can hold the ccTLD.sa and .saudia, the IDNA version of a Saudia label. Today I'll present a brief